So welcome everyone. So this is our second happy hour conversation, and this week we're fortunate to have Jen Gaugler. Um, Thank you so much for coming. And so the topic that you picked tonight was about non-conventional career paths with a degree in architecture. And so a few of the editors the other night made some questions just to ask you and to kind of catalyze the conversation. Um, so, without further ado, um, kind of our first question would be can you briefly describe your career path from your undergrad experience until now, just to map out what you've done so far?
Yes, absolutely. I know I said I didn't prepare anything, but I actually did prepare some notes on that because my career path has been long and kind of winding, and I didn't want to forget anything. And so if you see me looking down, I'm just looking at my notes real quick. So basically, starting from undergrad, I'll start in high school, actually, if you don't mind, because I'll just explain that in high school, I was really into art and I was really into math and science. And so I looked at art schools at some point, but eventually math and science kind of won out for me. I really was really into physics and stuff like that. Thought I wanted to be an engineer, wrote my college admissions essays about robotics, which is odd to think about now, but that's what I thought I was going to do when I went into undergrad. So I started at MIT freshman year. I actually thought I was going into, like I said, an engineering major. And then freshman year, you take all the same classes at MIT. Basically, they're just kind of general requirements. So freshman year, I didn't have to think about it that much. Second year, we started to take classes in our major, and I was in a lab, an engineering lab course. And I remember by like the second week, I was like, oh, I'm not interested in this. So I was also taking a architecture history class just as an elective, and I was interested in that. And so basically, that's how I changed my major. And I started taking architecture studios and kind of got myself into like that path. So I did end up graduating from the architecture department, but it was a 4-year degree. It was actually a Bachelor of Science in Art and Design, even though it was technically architecture. Don't know why they called it that, but not a NAB accredited degree. So as you guys probably also know, that I couldn't get licensed as an architect with that degree. So I knew at some point if I was going to become an architect that I would go back to school and get a master's, but I decided I wanted to take some time off before doing that. So I thought I would take 1 year off. It turned into 4 years. I was working at Goody Clancy, which is a pretty big firm here in Boston. They do architecture, planning, and historic preservation. And I was sort of between the architecture and historic preservation departments at the firm, and got to work on some really interesting projects. I was just learning a lot. It was just going well. And so somehow it became 4 years that I was there. But after a while, I kind of thought like, this isn't really like, I'm not as passionate about this as I want to feel. And I thought, okay, maybe what I want is like a less corporate experience in architecture. And I want to look more at sort of working in the nonprofit world or design for the greater good. And so when I was applying for MArch programs, that was kind of at the forefront of my mind. And I ended up applying to and getting accepted to Tulane, which is down in New Orleans. And that was about 4 years after Hurricane Katrina. So there was at that time, as there still is, a lot of opportunity for working with the community, for rebuilding, for just sort of being at a school that looked outside of itself and looked at the city around it. That's what I really liked about Tulane. And so I had a great experience there. I did a 2-year MArch program. I won a travel fellowship during that time, so I got to go abroad for the first time. So that was really important to me. After I graduated, I was then hired by Mass Design Group, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. They're also based here in Boston, and that was to work in Rwanda for a year. And I was primarily working on doctors' housing near a hospital that they had previously built. And that was just a really great experience. That was my first time really living abroad for a longer period of time. We got to work with local architects and engineers, so I thought that was really important. So there were a lot of things that were good about that experience, but I ended up realizing that I really actually missed academic conversations about architecture. And so then I went back to school again for a PhD at Berkeley with the goal of teaching. I decided, you know what, I've tried the nonprofit world in architecture, and even that wasn't quite fulfilling me. I think I really miss like the school environment. And so I went back to Berkeley, or sorry, I went back to school at Berkeley, got my PhD, did my dissertation on Rwanda, and then I started teaching here in Boston while I was at the like kind of the tail end of my PhD while I was finishing my dissertation. I moved here and I started teaching at Wentworth and the BAC. I taught as an adjunct for 2 years. And we can talk more about what that means later if you guys want to. But so I was an adjunct for 2 years. This year, for the first time, I'm a full-time, albeit temporary, professor. So I'm a visiting professor now, which is great. And I'll also just add that in case we want to get into it, I also do freelance work as an editor and a proofreader, sort of on architectural writing. So that's something I do on the side. So I think that more or less catches you up to where I am now.
That's really interesting, like the kind of the full circle of the architecture surroundings, like editing, kind of going into preservation, architecture, and then kind of nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this leads into our next question. How has the work that you've done in Rwanda affected the way that you look at your professional work now?
Oh, that's a great question. Going there, living there, and working there was so transformative for me. I think especially as an American who like didn't really have direct exposure to cultures outside of the boundaries of the U.S. when I was growing up. It really just sort of made me, I think about other perspectives on the world, like look at my own sort of life or my own background like with fresh eyes. And I think like that idea of kind of broadening your perspective and trying to understand the world outside of what you know, I try to bring that to definitely to my teaching. Like that's a huge goal of mine. I'm still working on it, but I've really tried to incorporate more sort of non-Western architecture here at Wentworth. We need to study things outside the US and outside of Europe. And so I think that was a direct influence sort of on my teaching. I'm not really practicing architecture at the moment. It's been a few years for me on that. So I maybe I'll get back into that. And I think it would also have an impact, I'm sure, on the way I think about design at some point. But for me, lately, it's been more about impacting my teaching.
It's really interesting. I'd like to mention that anyone can butt in and ask a question whenever they feel like. So don't just rely on me. Or if you don't feel comfortable, you can also put the question in the chat, and then I can or someone else can ask it. Um, I think it's really interesting how that kind of like experience of broadening your kind of perspective, kind of going outside of the. I feel like a lot of times people kind of get this siloed view of what not just architecture but whatever they're studying is, and I think for us as students, uh, we always get siloed, especially at Wentworth, we get siloed into this idea that we have to go through the BSArch program, probably go through the MArch program, and just work at an architecture office. But I think your story is really interesting to see that you can do other things as well with this kind of degree. And kind of if you decide to go down this like the path of like practicing in a firm, there are actually quite a few opportunities to kind of differentiate what you're doing from someone else.
Absolutely.
Um,
If I could butt in.
yeah.
Sorry. Um, no, it's very interesting to see a very wide range of things that you've accomplished. It's always fun to find out new things about those who are professing or teaching here at Wentworth. It's like I never not learn something.
Yeah.
um, and I guess that builds up the question of, I guess, what are your goals for what you want to achieve in academia, and what would you assume to be like a more broader set of goals after that possible achievement?
That's a great question. That is currently, I think, in some ways, a very loaded question because I have goals in academia, but academia is also a very unstable place to try and work right now. And so, um, it would be great if I end up being able to stay here at Wentworth, becoming a permanent faculty member, and developing. I mean, I have so many ideas for courses that I think would be so interesting. And, I'm really interested, for example, so I'm already teaching a course about the architecture of globalization in the spring. I don't know if you guys have seen the course offerings yet, but I think you have to be a senior maybe for that. But that's going to be great. And then I'm also really interested in teaching students more about their sort of environment around them. So I taught when I was at Berkeley. It was the equivalent of sort of a TA, I guess. We called a graduate student instructor, but I helped teach a course on like kind of the vernacular environment and just looking at everyday landscapes around us, like strip malls or like, I don't know, everything that we sort of don't necessarily study in architecture school. I've always been interested in that. So that would be a huge goal of mine to kind of get students out into the environment around them, whether it's, your home city or town that you're from, or it's Boston and the area around Wentworth, to do more courses that involve kind of literally physically going out into the city and kind of walking around, looking at things and understanding our environment. I think there's been courses like that in the past at Wentworth, but that's something I've always been interested in. But in terms of, I'll be honest with you guys right now, with everything going on in the pandemic and budget cuts at the school and all that, like it's not necessarily a given that I will be able to stay in academia. And so I also have backup plans, and those involve leaning more on sort of my training as a historian. So looking at becoming maybe a consultant, and someone who kind of works with local firms, and contracts out as a consulting historian. So that's kind of my backup plan. I hope that answers your question.
It
I think
definitely does. Thank you.
I think especially now since this pandemic has happened, even before, I think like the academic job market has been extremely volatile, um, to
Yes.
the point where now even certain schools like Harvard with their like the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, they're actually not even accepting any form of applications to certain programs, just because they don't want to oversaturate an already saturated job market. Um, I think it's a really good idea to have different options or backup plans. Can you speak a little bit more into that?
Yes, I am happy to. And NJ might want to also add some observations on this, but you're absolutely correct in saying that even before the pandemic, academia was already kind of a shaky place to try and enter because there's been a trend over many years. It's accelerated recently, but I think it started decades ago, that schools want to hire more and more adjuncts, and fewer what's called tenure track professors who eventually go on to have tenure and sort of be permanent employees. And so from what I know, the ratio used to be that something like 75% of faculty were tenured or tenure track, and 25% were adjuncts who are part-time and contingent. And that has reversed. So basically now, and I'm not talking specifically at Wentworth, I don't know exactly, but just nationwide, it's something like 25% of all faculty now are, permanents or at least tenure track, and 75% are adjuncts. And it's been really, really hard for anyone hoping to become a professor to actually achieve that. I also just read a statistic earlier today that it's now something like 12% of people who get a PhD in like a humanities area will actually become a professor. 12%. So it's, the odds aren't great. And that was even before the pandemic. Just honestly, adjunct labor is cheaper, much, much cheaper. Like, you don't make a lot of money teaching as an adjunct, you don't get any benefits, and you can, you know, not be hired back at any time. And so that's something that has been going on in American higher education for a while, and is only gotten worse since 2008. What happened in 2008 is, you guys probably know, with the Great Recession, obviously that happened, but a lot of schools cut tenure lines and started hiring more adjuncts to save money, and those tenure lines were never replaced. So it got particularly bad at that time. And now it's like, I mean, this year is like, there are no jobs. There are no jobs on the market, or very, very, very few. And so those of you who, and I know I've spoken maybe with at least one or two of you about this before, who have asked me about sort of going into teaching, at this time, I would honestly tell you that becoming like a full-time professor, like, should probably not be your only plan. Like, it's really, really, really tough. And even if you have degrees from top programs, you have a PhD, you've done everything right, you have all this experience, it doesn't matter if the jobs aren't there. And so what I'm starting to say to students who might ask for advice on this, I'm not saying that you should never think about teaching. You might think about teaching the way adjuncting is meant to be, which is that you teach, you know, one class maybe, and then you have full-time employment somewhere else, or you have, you know, gainful employment that's supporting you, and you're not relying on that part-time teaching to be your livelihood. I think that's okay. Like, you can teach a class here and there because you like teaching, but yeah, thinking about it as a career path, like, I'm sorry if this is very negative, but I'm just trying to give you guys the full picture of what's out there, and it is bleak right now. So NJ, I wonder if you have any personal thoughts about that.
Well, there are actually a few other sort of influencing, or so there's the whole, I mean, we don't have TAs at Wentworth, but I'm not really sure why. It was explained to me once by Robert Gaugler, and it seemed like a bad reason, but at the time it made sense, and that's why. But a good chunk of the reason also is that a lot of places, you know, teaching assistants, or as she said, graduate teaching assistants or graduate fellows or various others teach as well. But often those people are actually more expensive than adjuncts because they often get a better stipend, and they get often benefits and maybe free tuition, all things you don't have to sort of do for the adjunct, right? So there's that. And then there's this other thing, which is in addition to like this trend that she mentioned, that Jennifer mentioned, that's been ongoing since, you know, and then got worsened in 2008. There's the whole gigification of our economy, right? So, you know, that's also affecting us. And there's an assumption. So in addition to sort of teaching, right, there are basically three things that you're expected to do, like within the institution, which is teach, research, and then service, right? And so you're expected to do more service because, you know, we have no staff. I mean, we had no staff till last week, and then we had few staff till last week, and now we have no staff, right? So there's an assumption that you're going to be even doing that in addition to sort of community engagement. And then on the flip side of all of that, you're supposed to do research. And also what's happened over the past few decades is that you're expected to go out and like get that money at a much greater, find funding at a much greater rate than you would have been ordinarily. So this leads to all sorts of problems, such as, I mean, it's less of an issue for us maybe, but like you can imagine people in pharmaceuticals, like going to pharmaceutical companies and getting funding to do research into pharmaceuticals, right? So there are all these conflicts, and so it's problematic, and so it leads to all sorts of crises. For me doing materials research, like nobody wants to research dirt; they want to research more modern stuff. So, you have all these things, and so they all add to that, and so the stakes and the requirements for becoming for breaking in are much higher than they used to be, and they're increasingly higher. And so people who maybe had a master's of architecture degree, who have been professors for 40 years, are now telling you, you need a PhD, you need maybe a postdoc. So it's much more challenging for sure. But again, it's not to say that you shouldn't consider it, because it can be very fulfilling. It's just that, you have to sort of understand that the economy in academia has changed. And then of course there's the online courses where you need fewer people, and presumably to teach 1,000 people in a studio. I don't know how that's going to work. Hopefully I'll be dead before that happens. But anyway, you guys know what you're doing, and I'm sure you'll do a marvelous job, and I'll sit in and
And there might be some hope along these lines if, like, I mean, we have a new administration, or at least we're supposed to have a new administration coming in nationally.
speak too soon. There's
I
going to be a
know,
coup.
I know, I shouldn't speak too soon, but it's possible if higher education does get more funding, or gets the equivalent of like a bailout, based on what the pandemic is doing to school budgets, it's possible that things could get better. So I don't want to be totally like doom and gloom about it, but I just want to be very realistic, in that's a really hard path to go down.
Jennifer?
I have a.
Oh.
Oh, sorry, Esty, you can.
Okay, sorry. I sort of want to go back to what you were saying just a minute ago about like the relationship between adjunct and like adjuncting and like practicing, or like having like a day job, because I think that's a model that we see somewhat frequently at Wentworth, right? Like lots of folks who are practicing in the area, many of whom are alumni of the program themselves, like have a 40-hour a week, which we all know is not actually 40 hours a week job, and then are also teaching like one studio. And I wonder, like, I totally understand what you're saying about how that's sort of how the model's supposed to work. But I also wonder, like, when we think about sort of the broader, like, workaholic culture in architecture and the expectations for like the demands on your time, how that may contribute to it, right? Because in some way, like, it is in firms, especially like when you're looking at a really local ecosystem like Boston, where architecture is like a very small, tight community. In some ways, it's in firms' best interest for schools to be like producing a new labor force, right? And so in some ways, it makes sense for firms to sort of support that or accommodate teaching to then produce that labor force. Like, I don't think that's like how people perceive it or how we think about it more broadly, right? Like, I think people are just working 60, 80 hours a week, and that's like sort of normalized. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how to sort of change the narrative around that.
And are you talking specifically about work-life balance for people who are working full-time and adjuncting on the side?
I mean, I think also like it trickles down in lots of ways, right? But yeah. I think there's sort of like a way in which that relationship could be beneficial to the people who want to teach and the students and the firms, and we just don't really perceive it that way right now, right?
Yeah. A lot of this stuff has to come from the top, and it has to come from the leadership in the situation. So in that particular scenario, like, I haven't actually done that myself. I've tried to only adjunct, which, like, do not try to survive on that. Like, luckily I'm married. That's about the only way that I can afford to live in Boston while I was adjuncting. But in terms of like, to get back to what you were saying about the, like, work-life balance and everything, ideally a firm, it is good for firms to have people go out and teach, because they build relationships with local schools. They get to know great students, they can start to hire from those schools. So it really is beneficial for a lot of firms to have that relationship. But I think the principals, or the people who are in charge of those firms, need to make it clear that, okay, if you're going to be teaching a studio, we only expect you to work 30 hours a week or whatever.
Right.
And I think at some firms that works better than others. Like, I know some people who are kind of okay with their balance, and others, like, again, if it's not coming from the top and you're just still expected to churn out the same amount of work while teaching, that's not a great model. So that's not great. It might be better for you as an individual from like an earning standpoint, because at least you're earning from both jobs. So that's helpful. But this work-life balance issue is a huge problem in architecture school, in architecture practice, in everything. It's becoming an issue more and more in teaching as we lose staff, and more demands are placed on your professors. And it's just, it's all a matter of sort of increasingly trying to get more out of less. And unfortunately, architects, and I'm not entirely well versed on like the history of architectural labor, but I do know that like there's ways in which architects have positioned ourselves to like not be valued as much as we should. And that's why architects have to work so much and they have to bill a lot. For some reason, we didn't do what lawyers and doctors seem to have figured out. Like we, went along with things like competitive bidding on projects and, keeping your costs low and things like that. And so it's a systemic issue in architecture, whether you're teaching or not teaching. But so it's tricky, because I want to say like the best situations that I've seen are ones where firm leaders or school leaders or whoever set a tone of what the expectations are and that they want to have work-life balance. But that's also easier to do in certain situations, like when your firm does really high-end custom residential projects for millionaires, and you can charge them a lot of fee, and that really helps with your work-life balance. And it's a little harder for people who are doing like, public projects or nonprofit projects or things like that. It's really hard. So I don't have a great answer, but I absolutely acknowledge and agree with you that it's a huge issue.
Thank you.
Kai put a couple of questions in the chat. This goes back to kind of a couple minutes before this. He's saying like he's saying architecture is considered one of the last gen ed majors, where it stays broad to allow for flexibility. But he's saying even lately we've seen a trend in micromanaging design. And he's asking, how does this affect the field as a whole? And is it the right decision if there's a market or if there's markets that are outright oversaturated? Or is the answer declaring more majors?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if I would exactly say architecture is entirely a gen ed type or like a liberal arts type of major, because you guys are getting a professional degree, or you're moving toward a professional degree, and you are considered to have specialized skills, and that is a good thing. Like in times of recession, it can be hard to find jobs, but generally an architecture degree does have value for that reason, because I could see how you might have trouble if you have like a degree in English or something, even though I think those are very valuable degrees to have. You might have trouble sort of parlaying that into a job. Whereas if you have an architecture degree, you can go to an architecture firm and say, here, I have a NAB accredited degree. I know how to do this. And so there's kind of a specific value in that I think is really good. I'm not sure, I'm wondering, Kai, if you could elaborate on the question of declaring more majors. Like, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Yeah, so let me reiterate a bit. So when I meant by gen ed, I meant in the sense that once you have an architecture degree, it's very easy to go into different sectors of architecture.
Yes.
So it's not hard to, if you want to do healthcare architecture, excuse me, if you wanted to do healthcare architecture, it wouldn't be a hard issue to jump into it. And then if you wanted to say focus specifically on, low rise or mid rise residential, you can make those transitions, whereas in other fields they're very specified on what they like want from you. And I guess what I'm going at is now lately there has been a bigger trend in starting to bring it down to a very specialized focus, and then creating more room for that specialized focus to be expanded on. And that could cause issues for those who may specialize solely in healthcare related architecture, and they graduate with a degree with only the experience of healthcare architecture. And then you get a situation like COVID-19 where hospitals are going bankrupt. Is it the right decision that we're going in this trend of micromanaging, I guess, the field itself?
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. I think no. Maybe I'm biased because I had this wandering path myself, but I feel like we should not be locking ourselves in during college to, I mean, architecture, yes, but like a certain type of architecture. I mean, how would you know that what you want to do? Maybe you guys, it's a little bit different because you guys have co-ops and you're gaining work experience while you're in school. I didn't have that, and so I mean, without trying it out, I would have not wanted to specify like this is the kind of architecture I'm studying. So I'm a big proponent of like we need to keep architecture school kind of broad and open and give people all different kinds of experience during it. And then maybe the one time you do start to like narrow in a little bit is your thesis. So like if you do the MArch program and I think thesis is a wonderful opportunity to be like, here's something I'm really interested in that I want to develop, like whether it is healthcare or sustainability or many other topics. I feel like that to me is the right balance. So the bulk of the education, I know you guys have concentrations and stuff like that, but I still think it's not that narrow. Like adaptive interventions could be a lot of different kinds of things. So I like the idea of keeping it open and broader until you get to thesis, then you get to do something you're interested in. To me, that works. And I haven't heard a lot about like the idea of people specializing in certain types of architecture while they're still an undergrad, but that to me would be the wrong way to go, in my opinion.
I've heard kind of different kinds of advice from different sources. Like, for example, I was talking to a professor a couple of weeks ago and she was talking to me about how she was saying a lot of the kind of, I wouldn't say highly advanced, but kind of the more successful people who are coming out from, say, like the MR program at Wentworth have kind of a specialized interest. However, kind of like looking at another article from someone else saying like they really valued their education because it was so broad and didn't make them assume things. Giving that, like making them make their own choices. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I lean toward keeping it open and keeping it broad. I think, it's so hard to, I think, know what you're interested in without getting out in the world and really getting into it. And so even if you do a co-op or something, I just think, why narrow your focus? I guess the argument for it is maybe like, oh, well, maybe a firm that specializes in one type of architecture is more likely to hire you because you seem to be experienced in that type of architecture. So sure, that makes sense if you're 100% sure that that's what you want to do after graduation. But like, as you can probably tell from my path, I don't think I was 100% sure at that time. And I'm really happy that, my undergrad education was just in architecture, like nothing specific, just architecture. And I took a lot of different kinds of studios. And I actually really liked that my professors like were kind of different and had different opinions. I actually really like that. And so it kind of enabled me to feel like there's a lot of different paths I can now take, and I'm going to explore some of those, and then I'm going to like change my path, and that's fine. And to me, having that flexibility, I think, was great. And so again, like, this is just an opinion. I'm not necessarily right about this, but I would be on the side of keeping the architecture education a little more general. School is like the one chance you really have to kind of explore who you are. And then you have to start narrowing things down and start closing doors later in your life, But to have all those doors be open to you upon graduation, I feel like that's exciting.
I really appreciate that comment, Jennifer. A lot of what you're saying really resonates with me. And I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit more to like what you see as the role of like the humanities in an architecture education, or sort of these more broad, you know, I think there's value in like a professional degree like you're talking about, or like the the like safer employability of an architecture degree, but given sort of like our crisis of liberal arts in this country, like how do you sort of sneak more of the like history and these other things that you're interested in into that professional degree, right? So you like,
right.
Because none of us actually learn, I mean, I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but none of us actually learn how to build a building in architecture school. Like you learn how to design and how to think about it.
Right.
You learn how to use Revit on co-op, right? And so like,
right.
Like how do you see, maybe this is more of like a pedagogical question, but how do you see like critical thinking and history and humanities and things like that playing into like the future of an architecture education?
Right. I mean, I think it's so important. And if you could tell me how I can get another semester of history theory in the curriculum, I would be thrilled, because frankly, I think 2 is not enough. Although I do know that some of the concentration studies, I think, do history theory topics. But in my mind, I'm like, we have 2 semesters to teach you guys like the history of architecture. It's not enough. There's so much that we cut out. It's really hard. But this is a constant and age-old struggle, I think, in a lot of these kinds of programs, balancing that you do need to know structure, and you do need to know at least, I don't know if you need to know like the ins and outs of Revit, but you do need to have some technical classes on drawing and stuff like that, which I actually think, I don't know if you guys have had that. I think that's something that they've added more recently. But there's all this stuff like these are the hard skills that you need to have versus like these are the sort of more theoretical or history-based or humanities type classes that broaden your mind as an architect. And I think those are absolutely so important, because there's so much power in architecture. Architecture shapes like our lives and our cities, and that has impact on people. And I really think it's so important for architects to have an awareness of history. And I don't just mean the history of architecture, but like history more broadly. Also, writing is something that I would love to see more and more incorporated. I think we do a decent job of that right now. And Robert Coward and I, we work on that a lot in our classes. We always try to work on writing, because being able to communicate and make critical arguments is so important for an architect. And so it's tough though, because there's, NAB accreditation has a huge impact on what you guys study. And, certain criteria are defined that you need to have this, this, and this. And so I would love to argue the fact that, all the social movements that we've seen in the past year, and Black Lives Matter and all of that has really, I hope, awakened us to this idea that we really need to study history even more. And we need to understand how these things intersect with our built environment. And that's our responsibility, that this is our major, right? And so I would love to see that push NAB a little bit to like, hey, let's get like even more history theory in the curriculum. But then there are people on the other side who will push back and say like, no, like students need to, especially because you do have co-ops, like you do need to know certain things before you go out in the working world that are more on the practical side. So it's a push and pull, and I recognize that I'm on one side, but there are also people who are on the other side who think that, these other things are also important, which they are. So
that's all wonderful, and it actually brought me a lot of questions, so don't be scared of the next few questions. They might be a bit loaded at times. So obviously there's been a lot that's been happening in the world, and I know that unless you have a premier focus on some of these issues, you're not going to see them, and you're not going to work with them in your field. I can tell you forever about the disconnect between urbanism and what we're learning versus what some may be learning in adaptive. That's just a small example, but The bigger issue I have is, you know, there's a lot to learn in architecture, and we have to do it here at Wentworth in 4 years without even considering masters. So what is a solution given that, you know, we already have very heavy schedules to introduce these classes? Is it to possibly rethink what we do for education? Like, is it about reconstructing education, or is it about, you know, extending our time in academia? I ask, I guess, like, what, how would you approach introducing these newer topics?
Right. A couple ways. I mean, one is electives can be a great opportunity for that. And I know, I think it's this spring, there is a new elective on sort of the role of race in the built environment, which I think is a very important course for Wentworth to be offering. And I'm really glad that that's coming to pass. And so that's one place. There is some room within the curriculum. There is some flexibility when you get to like the later years, I think, as far as I understand, particularly like senior year. But also it needs to be incorporated in the required courses that everyone takes. Like that's really important. It can't just be something that, you know, oh, I'm interested in these topics, so I'm going to seek them out. Like that's good, but you know, it's got to be in the foundational courses. It's got to be in History Theory 1 and 2 as well. And so another thing that we're doing as instructors, we're really looking hard at our course content. We're finding ways where we can connect to important political and social issues of our day. And one of the comments I had over the summer from students that I thought was really interesting was that they wanted to hear more about, like, as we were going through the history, which we do more or less chronologically, they were like, we also though want to know how this is connecting to today and connecting to our lives and what's going on in our world. And so you know, we already tried to do that, but we like ramped that up a little bit more and tried to, you know, for example, I gave a lecture on colonial architecture and colonial urban planning, and we talked about like the Belgian Congo, and then, you know, linked that to articles which literally had come out within the past, you know, month about people tearing down these statues in Belgium as part of the Black Lives Matter movement globally. And so it's an effort that you have to go to. You have to kind of look for those opportunities, I think, to explain that relevance and to also shine light on the history that may not always be in the textbook. Even though the textbooks are getting a little bit better over time, but like still not always great. You can talk to Robert Cowherd about that. That's why he's like, do not expect everything we teach to be in the textbook, because it's not good enough. But yeah, so that's my answer is both a combination of elective options, foundational classes. It's interesting, the idea of making the degree like it would be great if you guys had another year and you could take all these additional courses, but then realistically, people have a perception of value. When you pay for a degree, you want to, like, you know, get that degree, you know, within a certain amount of time. And I think efforts to extend architecture degrees wouldn't go over well in terms of like marketing those degrees to incoming students. So I think it has to be done within the curriculum that we have as much as possible.
You mentioned the idea of like not learning from a textbook. I've talked to Robert Cowherd about this a little bit. I think like the idea that we should be learning from primary resources and kind of getting to the meats and bones of these kind of ideas that we learn from the textbook. 'Cause I think at the end of the day, I don't think people realize that the textbook that we learn from is a very heavily curated and very biased opinion of more or less a Western kind of canon of architecture. Um, and I mean, like I've also noticed this in kind of my ethics courses, where it's a very like Western Eurocentric ideology. And some of the things that I read in the book are like, this should not pass. Like calling like people from like South America as kind of Aboriginals, or I forget, kind of an obscene term to call people. But I'd like to shift kind of using that as context and shifting it to a question that SD has in the chat. Given that this is kind of a call full of journal editors, former and current, would you be able to speak a little bit more about kind of your thoughts on the roles of writing in our curriculum? And do you see student publications as a part of remedying this or separate from the issue of curriculum?
Great questions. I think, as I think I said before, that writing is really, really important for architects. And it's, you know, you do have to be able to draw and design and think spatially, and all of that is really important. But when you're communicating to clients or whoever, you have to be able to put words together in a compelling way to talk about your design as well. Like, that's an important part of it. And so that's one huge reason that we meaning kind of the history theory and one of the thesis classes, which focuses on literature review, we in those classes really try to incorporate writing exercises every week. And it ramps up a lot when you're in the master's program, because you have to write a book. You actually write a 5-chapter book as part of your thesis. And there's a lot of writing in that year. And so I think writing is something that I would love to see like really emphasized early in the curriculum, so that students don't get to the MArch year and all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, now I have to write like a lot and I'm not used to it. Because writing, like anything, is a skill that you have to practice to keep that skill strong. It's not necessarily, I mean, maybe some people are a little bit inherently stronger at writing than others, but to be honest with you, it's something that everybody can practice and get better at over time. But it has to be, you have to use those muscles in order to keep them strong. And so I think it's super important. And then the question about student publications, I think the role of student publications is so important at Wentworth. I've been so impressed by them, and they really set the tone in a lot of ways for the school. I mean, this is a product that is put out by you guys and kind of shows everyone what Wentworth is all about. And so I know the school is like really, really proud of these things that you guys create as student publications. I don't know. I don't know about like how, like, I don't know if I would make that like mandatory. I'm not sure if that's the question, but like if you would like require it as part of the curriculum to like work on the student publications, I don't know. But I think it would be great to have as many people get involved with them as possible. Sorry, SD, I'm not sure if that's what you're asking.
No, I definitely wasn't asking if you would make them mandatory. Okay. I think oftentimes when we think about curriculum, we think of it as sort of like a top-down exercise of like faculty telling students like, this is what you're going to learn. And my experience, like as someone who likes to write, thinks that way, sometimes even more so than visually, was that like the journal specifically was like an opportunity to do that, where the curriculum like was lacking or didn't have that at that moment. So I don't know, I guess I'm not saying like would you require it, but just like how do you sort of support and encourage students who are like looking for that outlet sort of outside of the curriculum?
Right, that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly like through the student publications, but it'd be interesting if there were sort of more options within the curriculum to, I don't know how you would do it, but sort of like, oh, you can have the option to like write, because what I don't see happening, we do a lot of writing, like small writing in the history theory 1 and 2, we do like little paragraphs, and then we do those kind of collaboratively produced chapters, but that's like with 10 people. I don't know how often do you guys write like research papers, like maybe in some of the concentration studies?
I mean, things might have changed in the last like 4 years, but for an architecture class, I wrote 1 research paper in all of undergrad.
Yeah.
Wow.
The only other writing I did was in like humanities electives outside the department. And then even during thesis, which you're right, that's like the most writing to do. So Robert Coward was my thesis advisor, and we spent like the entire spring semester bickering because all I wanted to do was write more. And he's like, you have to make something. I mean, we have a very good relationship. Like it wasn't bad, but I think even like in the ways that we encourage writing the most, it sometimes feels insufficient.
Yeah, I'm kind of encountering that kind of problem with my grad school applications, like applying to anything other than an MArch program. Like I'm applying to like a SMARCS program at MIT and they require a writing sample. However, I look at my writing and I'm like, well, I have stuff from war, but like it's not long enough and it doesn't seem academic enough. And like the only writing that I see fit is one paper that I wrote last year or in the spring. And I'm like praying, like hoping that this actually works. So I think like writing in general seems to be like a lacking thing in the department, especially like at a review. The only thing you really write about is kind of your notes to make sure you don't kind of slip up on your presentation. But there's never kind of any requirement about writing about what you're doing, your narrative. Because I think like at the end of the day, a lot of these architecture projects are about narratives. Like that's the whole kind of culmination at the final reviews. You're framing a problem and you're creating a narrative to solve it.
But I think there's structural and even and as well as logistical challenges to what you guys are asking for. And what I would call the logistical from, say, my position as a teacher is that if I don't give a uniform assignment, it makes my work a lot harder, as Jen would say. So I'm disinclined to do that. But then even if I do, often students won't take the opportunity because there are structural reasons why, because there's a way in which, for the earlier reason I said, we've kind of created a pipeline. And anytime you jump off the pipeline, you're concerned, right? You're concerned about going off, off the rails. So I don't know the real answer. I mean, I've just kind of dumbed down my writing assignments in studios where I just ask students, write a manifesto. And then they look at me and say, what's a manifesto? And I'm like, I don't know, you make it up. But it's hard to actually convince many students to write.
Yes.
And then the students who want to write just don't know how to stop. It's like, and then, so that's the other thing that we don't teach enough, right? Which Jen could probably talk about, which is editing, right? Which is just as important, right? If not more so, right? Knowing how much to say and what of what you have said, like right now I'm flailing about and finding a good place in my remarks to stop.
Well, and to your point, NJ, like requiring writing and then giving the feedback that is really necessary to like make that writing better, it requires so much more labor from faculty who are like already stretched thin. And so it goes back maybe to the beginning of this and some of those larger systemic problems that sort of started this conversation. But like without making space for that and making the time for faculty to really like read and give feedback on that much writing, you can't really expect it to happen. I'm TAing like undergrad thesis in my current grad program, and it like the whole thing is just a writing workshop. That's literally all we do for the whole semester. And it's just like it's blowing my mind sort of how much time and labor it takes to make good writing.
How many students do you have?
So there are 11 students, and one professor and me.
Oh, that's possible.
Wow.
That's great.
Yeah.
With
Wow.
with the increase in section sizes next semester, I'm looking at a maximum of 90 students for the semester. So you can imagine that I can't realistically give feedback on 90 research papers. It's just literally impossible. But having said that, I find it really interesting, like you guys are helping me think about the fact that some students want the opportunity to do this, and maybe there are ways to build it in, especially for the upper level classes, because I think the process of doing a research paper from start to finish, like the research and then the first draft, the editing, which is, as NJ was saying, super important. But bringing that all together into like, you know, maybe, I don't know, 5 to 8 page, or maybe even a bit longer, but doing that is like a nice intermediate step between the small writing you do in sophomore year and then like the thesis book, which is just like, you're like, oh my God. So yeah, maybe this idea of something in between those in the senior year, because I tend to teach electives in the senior year. So you've given me something to think about. So thank you.
Another way to sort of think about doing narrative, and I had initially built it into my studio, and then I found out I only had 11 weeks, was to actually, because you guys are more comfortable with video, to actually sort of narrate, as in speak, and do it just by yourself to a camera, and then go back and write that. But I had to take it out because crunch time. And again, a part of it is like figuring out how to sort of set up the assignment so that you can just kind of take it and run and don't need to check in with me would be ideal. And if anybody has any ideas, I'm welcoming them.
I don't have any ideas to be welcomed right now, but I would kind of like to jump back a little bit. I had like I mentioned before about the primary sources. Do you think students would be more inclined to write about kind of things that they're talking about if they're actually reading the primary sources? For example, like in studio, maybe like this happens more in the the seminars that we have for our concentration classes. Um, but say if you're reading like Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture or Rainer Banham's Design in the First Machine Age, do you think students would be more inclined to be interested in kind of the history and learning about and writing about kind of how we've gotten to this point in time with architecture?
Mhm. It's a really interesting question. I mean, to be transparent, I don't necessarily like teaching with a textbook, but I understand like other instructors at Wentworth do think it's a good idea because it kind of gives you that overview that you sometimes might need when you're like in your second year and you don't know a lot about architecture history yet, and you kind of just need the big picture of how these things fit together. So I understand the arguments for using a textbook. When I teach like an elective in senior year, I will never use a textbook. I only use like articles and primary sources because I just think I agree with you that immediacy is, I think, really important for students to become interested in the material. Like, let's be honest, textbooks may be informative, but they're generally not fun to read. Like, I know that. But maybe they give you the information you need at that level. And then at a later, more advanced level, you can kind of delve into all different sources. I think that's the thinking that I understand to be in place at Wentworth. And it makes some sense to me, but I don't know. I mean, if we did that in History Theory 1 and 2, I don't know if students would find it more engaging or if they would find it somewhat disjointed. I'm not really sure. It's something I'd actually like to poll. I'm going to poll my students about this actually, because in History Theory 1, we're actually planning to like have a session at the end with feedback and this kind of information gathering. So I'll ask more students about that. Yeah, again, to me, the type of reading, I kind of base it on the year in the program that students are in, which may or may not be a good idea.
Thank you, NJ, for correcting me. Like learning from Las Vegas when complexity and contradiction are not primary sources, they're building off of information. But do you still think that's important to kind of these seminal works of very important theorists who have influenced our understanding of architecture and architecture's role in kind of like our social political environment. Even like Delirious New York by Rem Koolhaas. I remember Mark Pasnick gave us a summer reading list my freshman year of kind of these works that kind of were never ever introduced to us, not even in our history theory seminars, but they've gone on to influence what I will assume to be like generations of architects and architectural thinking.
Yeah, what I find an interesting model is actually what we did at Berkeley, and I TA'd essentially the equivalent of history theory 1 and 2, I guess. It was, for some reason, it was only grad students. Okay, I think, sorry, it was a different course, but it was the same material. It was just at a graduate level for people who didn't have an undergrad degree. Anyway, what we did is, I don't even remember, I think there was a textbook involved, but we actually had students read manifestos. And when NJ said manifesto earlier, it like kind of reminded me of that. We did have students read those over the course of the semester, like all different kinds of manifestos, and then they had to write their own manifesto. And I thought that was great because it was like, who are you as an architect? Who do you want to be as an architect? Like, write a manifesto for that, but do that after you've read all these other ones that have been very influential. So I think like that's something, it could be really interesting to incorporate. But again, do you do that in history theory 1 and 2, or do you do it later? But yeah, I think reading the words of the architects themselves is important, and I agree with you. I don't know if it happens enough at Wentworth. I don't know in what courses that gets incorporated. Maybe you guys know better than I do, but I think it is very important. I agree with you on that.
I can say when I went to architecture school many centuries ago, we did a lot of that. And it was very difficult for someone like myself to get. But in addition to sort of reading a lot of those architects, we read a lot of philosophers, typically French and or German. And then, some of the sort of more classical Greek ones. And that in of itself leads back to sort of the problematic issues that both Matt and Kai raised earlier about, the position, shall we say, or the the white male's gaze or the white male's perspective being imposed. And I didn't have a problem necessarily. I mean, as I got older, I had some issues with some of it, but at the time I didn't necessarily have a problem with that, but I couldn't relate to it, which was another problem, which leads to your other problem about like people having the interest to actually engage themselves and do writing. So if I can't relate to what's being discussed, then I'm not going to engage, and so I'll check out, and so I'll just go to studio and build another model. So
it's a really good point. Yeah, like not everyone's words have been published. That's something that I have a book of architectural manifestos. They're all like white European and American males, which, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in there, but like, how do I augment that? I have a great manifesto from Nigeria, but there's other architects around the world who've done important work that it's a bit harder to find sometimes these primary kind of, or these like manifesto type of sources. And so ideally there'd be some amazing textbook that like is really well balanced globally and incorporates, original language. And, that would be amazing. Maybe I should write this. This should be my next career. But all of this stuff is sort of a balance at the end of the day. And so I think we need to do a better job maybe of collecting a broader range of that type of material. And then I'd feel even more comfortable introducing it.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand that. Like, I'm pretty sure almost all of my kind of the readings that I've done, kind of like the canonical texts that people kind of laud, only one or two of them are actually like female authors, and I don't think any of them are actually people of color.
Right.
Um, so it's just kind of like this continued kind of dominance of the white male on top of architecture. But I guess it leads to the question of like, just because someone is like white or male, does that mean that the discipline or their writing that they have is kind of written from kind of their point of view? Like, I think they have other experiences in their lives that can influence their architecture. Um, I think like this question is brought up a lot. Like, is the writer autonomous from their writing?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I'm generally not in favor of throwing out anything in architecture history, just adding to it.
Mm.
That's my stance, which is why we need more semesters of history theory, because
Yeah.
that's the problem that I run into is I'm like, oh, but I want to add a whole lecture on African architecture. I want to add like, all these things around the world. And Greg Logan, who's like a specialist in East Asia, which is amazing. Like we're bringing in these faculty members now who study different parts of the world outside of the West. And we have all this stuff to add. But then there's all this other stuff that we're like, well, that stuff is still important. It still had a lot of influence, and we want to teach it. So like, it is really, really hard because I literally am like, please give me a third semester of history theory. It should be history theory 1, 2, and 3. That would help a lot to help, diversify what we can teach. But if we can't do that, I don't know, you just have to make some hard choices. And you do have to occasionally throw some things out in order to add other things. And so you just have to make choices about what you think is the most helpful for students in giving them a broad knowledge of architecture history, but teaching them everything that they're going to be expected to know as well.
When I was in school, the year that I took the graduate history, American, there was an American history, architecture history course, in addition to our regular ones. And the year I took it, the guy was leaving and he was mad. So he completely rewrote the curriculum and he did like everything except modern American architecture. So I learned about the Shakers, the Inuits,
Wow.
it was just awesome. Like, so, sometimes you get lucky. And I would encourage you to sort of like, just seize those opportunities when they appear. And all, the other thing I always advise people is like, even if you're like in a tech course, like go to the teacher and say, can I like do something slightly different, run a different experiment? Go up to your history and theory teacher and say, can you run a different research paper?
Mm-hmm.
But you have to give more, because you realize that when you do that, you're asking the teacher also to do more work. So you have to really come to the table, like bring it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're really like passionate about it, do it. There's nothing that makes a teacher more excited than a student being excited about some topic area and that they want to just like grab a real good hold of and try and wrestle it to the ground. And don't worry about failure. That's what school's for.
Totally agree with everything you just said.
Does anyone have any other questions to bring up to either Jen or NJ?
Not necessarily a question, but it was nice to hear everything from both you, Jennifer, and NJ. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to be here. And I really miss like being on campus for the opportunity to just kind of casually chat with students. Like, I mean, I think we all know how lonely this has made us, but this has been so, so nice because, you lecture and then students say thank you, which is lovely. I love that at the end of Zoom. It's like, thank you, I can hear your voices, but, then we all hang up. And so it's been great to actually hang out a bit.
Thank you so much for joining us. I think we all really appreciated you having us or coming here and joining us in this kind of nonchalant conversation about our ramblings and our questions and concerns. especially when other people and other places don't seem to listen to us.
Well, if I could just say one final thought, it would just be that I know sometimes architecture school makes you feel like there's this really particular path that you're going to have to follow, and you're going to like do this, ABC, and then you're going to get your license, and that's that. And that's great for many people. And it's totally fine. I'm not like saying anything's wrong with that at all. But like, if you're like, I don't know exactly what my future is going to look like, or I don't know if I want to like work in a firm forever, or maybe I do, but I want to do something else first. Like, just please know that like there's a whole world of possibility out there. I know it's hard to imagine in this current economic climate, but hopefully things will get better soon. And those explorations that you take along your path, if your path is kind of winding and doesn't necessarily lead straight from point A to point B, that can really enrich your life. So like, don't be afraid of not knowing exactly where you're going to be in 5 years or 10 years, because you might end up doing something you never thought you would do, and it would be really cool. And that's happened to me a few times. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you guys so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
So thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.